right, and welcome back for the second session of our conference. This time we're going to be listening to Glenna Shaw. Glenna Shaw has been an accessibility advocate since 2001. She has over 2 decades of experience with presentations, data visualizations, dashboards, demos, prototypes, and system user interfaces. She is a certified project management professional and a Microsoft PowerPoint Most Valued Professional. So without further ado, going to play Glenna's video.
Hello everyone, my name is Glenna Shaw and I'm very happy to be leading this session on how to create accessible Excel spreadsheets. The first thing I want to cover is what is accessibility. The Oxford Dictionary defines accessibility as being the quality of being able to be reached or entered, the quality of being easy to obtain or use, or the quality of being easily understood or appreciated. So you can see accessibility is really about ease of ability. An important thing to realize is that most of us use some type of assistive technology. When we watch foreign films, we watch with subtitles if we don't understand the language. When we pull our suitcases behind us when we're traveling, we take advantage of curb cuts that have been put in the sidewalk for wheelchairs. Most of us talk to Siri or we talk to Google. And of course, there's millions of us who need to wear glasses just to be able to see. When we're crafting our documents, the main things we want to consider are going to be the domains of functioning. Now, there are actually 6 domains of functioning, but for our purposes, we'll only be talking about 4: visibility, audibility, comprehensibility, and mobility. When we're talking about visibility, we wanted to take into account folks who'll be using screen readers. They might be using high contrast settings for our low vision persons or magnifiers. We also want to consider color blindness. And then another thing that you might not think about is being aware that some people are visual learners. Audibility means we want to consider persons who have little or no hearing, or persons who might be speaking a different language. So we want to include captions and subtitles, or if we are speaking in person, we might want to get a sign language interpreter. When we're talking about comprehensibility, we mean understanding. So we want to present things in plain language. As my grandmother would say, why use a $100 word when a $1 word would do? We want to keep things simple. We want things to be clear. And we also want to summarize any kind of complex information. There are 2 components to mobility. The first is physical mobility, and that means that we need to consider how a person is going to navigate through our documents. Some people will use a mouse, some people will be using a keyboard, and also now we have styluses as well as touch screens. The second component of mobility is device mobility. We want our products to look the same no matter what device our consumer is viewing it on, whether it's a smartphone, a laptop, tablet, desktop, no matter what browser they might be using, no matter what operating system they might be using. We want to make sure they all look the same. I've included a couple of graphs here to show the level of reported difficulty in the different domains of functioning. Now, this encompasses all 6 domains, but in the graph on the left, for adults who are 18 to 64, only about 5% report having a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all. About 25% say some difficulty, but fully 70% have no difficulty. Now, that changes drastically when you get to the percentage of adults age 65 and older, which is shown in the graph on the right. About 25% of older folks have a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all, and then an additional 40% have some difficulty. So it's only about 30% who have no difficulty at all. And what that tells us is that you can count on at some point in your life, you're probably going to need some type of assistive technology yourself because we don't grow younger. So let's talk about the main Excel accessibility features. Just by its nature, Excel is already an assistive technology application. A spreadsheet is a computer application for the organization, analysis, and storage of data in a tabular form so that it can be more easily understood. And I've illustrated that here on the right. At the top, what you'll see is data that's listed in a text-based narrative format. And then below that is the same data in a tabular format. And it's easy to see that in the tabular form, it's much easier to comprehend and understand the information. Here's our first standard worksheet, and what we're going to cover are the fundamentals for making Excel spreadsheets accessible. And we want to start out with text formatting. Text formatting is the easiest thing to do. In a spreadsheet, you're almost always going to have your text. It's going to be a black text on a white background, which is going to have high enough contrast and generally, as a rule, be easy enough to read. People have their own option for being able to zoom in and out on a spreadsheet, so size is not as much of a concern as it might be in, say, a presentation. But on occasion, you do want to format your text differently. And when you do that, if you want to highlight something, or in our example here, we have a first line of text that we want to be actually a header for this worksheet. So what we want to do is we want to look at the cell styles. The cell styles drop down is in the styles section on the home tab in our toolbar, and we want to change this to heading 1. Now when someone's using a screen reader and they read this text, it's going to clearly identify this text as a header for our worksheet. Next, we want to make sure that the text is legible by not being truncated, and you'll see this frequently where text doesn't automatically wrap in Excel, so you'll see it truncated in columns. And what you want to do is make sure that your column is wide enough to show all of your text. Here we can drag this column so that it shows all of our text as opposed to being truncated, or you can select cells and you can select the format drop down and say auto fit column width. In addition, you can see that we have these little markers here that show that there's an error. That's what these little yellow things are for. That's because we have these years here formatted as text, and Excel is recognizing that they're numbers. So they're asking, are you doing this deliberately? In this instance, we are. So we want to hide this error from anyone who we might share this spreadsheet with. We certainly don't want this popping up and showing if we're sharing this spreadsheet with someone. For our numbers, we want to keep our numbers as simple and understandable as possible. In this instance, these numbers are representing percentages, but you can see that we have, 6, 7, 8 numbers after the decimal point. What we want to do is change the formatting of this so that it actually is percentages. We go over here to the number section in the toolbar, select the drop down, and we change it to percentage. Now, by default, Excel is going to leave 2 decimal points on that number. Whenever I'm working with percentages, especially in like this instance, I'm okay with rounding it up. So I'm going to make those percentages go away by selecting these increase or decrease decimal point numbers. That's what these little icons on the toolbar here are for. In addition, in Excel, you can put graphical elements on your worksheet, such as pictures or shapes or whatever you choose. So there's a couple of things you want to make sure if you do choose to do that. First of all, you want to make sure that they're in the appropriate reading order, and then you also want to add alt text to those graphical elements. Charts also fall in this category. You want to add alt text to them so that if a person is using a screen reader, they have a narrative description for whatever these graphical elements are. What we want to do is go to the editing section of the home toolbar, click this drop down for find and select, and open the selection pane. When the selection pane comes up, what it shows us is it shows picture 1 and textbook 1. Well, the reading order is actually from the bottom to the top. So the first thing you want read, you want it to be on the bottom. The last thing you want read, you want it to be on the top. In this instance, this is exactly how we want it, although we don't necessarily want our checklist named text box 2. That's rather a non-descriptive name that tells us nothing. So we can actually change that name here and rename it to checklist. Now that we have that in the order we want, we can close that selection pane and we can go over here to review. Remember, we want to add alt text here and go to the review tab, and you have a check accessibility section. So we want to choose this drop down. And the first thing we want to do is we want to select options, ease of access. This will take us to the Excel options, and we want to make sure that this box here, it is checked by default, but you may have unchecked it. You want to keep the accessibility checker running while you work. That way, while you do that, Excel will notify you, and it'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in making your spreadsheets accessible. Now we also want to check this drop down and open up our alt text pane. You can see our shape here that has our checklist text in it. It has no alt text. To fix that, all we're going to do is copy our text that we have in our shape by selecting it and hitting Control C. We'll paste it in here, Control V, and now we have our alt text for our checklist. We also select the picture. You can see the picture, because we've inserted it from stock images, it automatically has a description in there, which is nice, and this description is just fine with me. I'll leave it at that. Or I could also mark this as decorative. When you mark an image as decorative, what it means is that a person using a screen reader, it'll skip right over it. We can close our alt text pane. Go back over here. Another thing I want to mention are grid lines. Typically in a spreadsheet, grid lines are very helpful, but sometimes they can actually obscure the information that's on our worksheet. So you might want to experiment with that by selecting the View toolbar, and you can uncheck grid lines, and you can see here in this instance, our information on this worksheet is actually a lot more visible and a lot easier to see. So we'll go ahead and keep our grid lines turned off here. Then for hyperlinks, when you add hyperlinks, and this is particularly important because you always, if you're putting data in a worksheet, you always want to include your source, but you don't want your hyperlinks to just be these cryptic URLs. So what you want to do is make sure to give your hyperlink descriptive name. So when somebody's clicking on the hyperlink or selecting the hyperlink, they know what they're going to get when the browser opens up. To do this, you want to edit the hyperlink, and you simply change the text to display to give it a meaningful name. In this instance, this is a CDC report on reduced access to care. And now you can see our hyperlink has a much more meaningful name. Somebody selecting the hyperlink is going to know what they're getting before the browser window opens. Our worksheets are always, on the tabs, are always going to come with a default name. So we want to make sure to change those to give those a meaningful name, so that when somebody is navigating through the spreadsheet, then the name is always, they're going to know beforehand what they're going to get on the spreadsheet. And then finally, our accessibility checker. I already showed you some of that, but here's one of the nice things about the accessibility checker. You look in the status bar, you can see this, the accessibility checker here is telling us that we're good to go. So if we open it up, you can see that there's no accessibility issues have been found with this workbook, which is a good thing. Next up, let's talk about small data. I'm defining small data tables as having equal to or less than 10 rows and equal to or less than 10 columns. Basically, what I'm talking about here is a data table that you can either look at or experience with a screen reader and hold that information within your memory. Okay, now we're going to talk about formatting a small data table. Now, the accessibility checker won't check for this, but anytime you're using a data table, especially, or any kind of table, it's not good enough to format it just visually. Typically, you'll see people might select this here, and then you'll see them fill this in, to create a header. But from a screen reader perspective, that's not a header at all. What you really need to do is, right now we're talking about small data, which is basically a data table that is the less than 10 rows and less than 10 columns. Even at that, that's an awful lot to try and hold in your head. But we have a small data table here that is a great example. And what we want to do is select the whole table. And then you'll select Format as Table. And you can select one of these designs, or you can create your own design. Now, our data table does have headers, so we want to leave this box checked. And we'll select OK. And you can see, now this created what is truly identified as a table in Excel. And you see you have these little buttons that allow you to drop down. You can do sorting, you can filter using these drop downs. But the main thing is now you have it formatted as a table. And you can see up here, as soon as you get table design, you want to make sure you check this box for a header row. And you also want to check the box for first column. And the reason why is when somebody is reading using a screen reader, they'll be able to identify that this cell here is using the no difficulty header for the year 2010. And that's what checking these boxes does for you. In addition, another nice handy feature for the tables is that you can add a total row. Now, what a total row will do is it'll automatically, it will sum automatically the last column in a table, but you can easily change this. In this instance, we want this to be average, so you just click this drop down and you change it to average, and you can do that for each of these columns. So now you get an average of all of these years, and this will give you a total average. You can notice this is a whole lot more decimal points than we want. So we can easily fix this with text formatting, just like we covered in the previous section. We will go ahead and eliminate all these extra decimal points that we have here. So you can see making a data table accessible is pretty easy, because you're going to use the Format as Table tool, and then take advantage of all the features that are in that particular function. Now let's discuss big data. Large data tables are going to be anything larger than having more than 10 rows or more than 10 columns. In other words, it's just too big to be absorbed as a whole. So it's going to need to be sliced and diced and summarized and manipulated for comprehension. Now we're going to talk about big data. And in our example here, what we have is a table of data that is 14 columns wide and over 7,000 rows long. So unless you're like some kind of super brain, there's just no way you're going to be able to absorb or comprehend this much data just by looking at it in a table. So what we want to do is we want to summarize this table, and the way we've already formatted it as a table like we did with the small data, but in this instance we're going to want to summarize it as a pivot table. I've already done this, and we have this pivot table on the next worksheet. You can see it here. Now with a pivot table, what you do is you have all your column headers are listed in your pivot table fields, and then you get to decide which of these columns you want to use as a filter, which you want to show up as the columns, which you want to show up as the rows, and what you want to make as the value. Now, when you add a value into the pivot table field for values, it's automatically going to default to sum, to add up all the values in the column or in the row. So what you want to do is make sure that if sum is what you want, you can leave it alone. In my example, what I wanted was averages, so I have changed the value field setting to show average as opposed to sum. And you want to clearly label those in the field because that's how they're going to show up over here within your pivot table. So you want to make sure your field names are meaningful field names. You want to add totals because they help summarize. You can see we get a grand total for columns and we also get a grand total for rows. It's important that we know that these are averages. They aren't actually summing anything up. But what we want to do here, and this is really important, is we want to choose the pivot table options. We choose that drop down, and we want to make sure that we fill in the alt text for the pivot table. Here, what we've done is we've given it a title, we've given it a description, and a person with a screen reader can navigate a pivot table. So what you're doing with the alt text is helping them to decide whether they want to go through the trouble of navigating the pivot table. With a pivot table, one of the nice things about it, you can see that I have placed subgroup and indicator in the columns, and I've placed years, and this is time period end date. So we could actually rename this to months because that's what this is showing. So it's showing the months and year. Then what that allows us to do, the pivot table is automatically going to group years and compress them, but you have these buttons here that allow you to expand the pivot table further. In addition, we've got the same thing up here for each of our age groups. We can expand it, and these are the different types of indicators for each of the age groups. The nice thing about this is that it helps with the cognitive understanding of that big data. It chunks everything out into what the person who's looking at that data wants to focus on, which is the beauty of pivot tables. Data visibility or charts is going to be our next topic. I'm using Chartability as my resource for how to make charts accessible. Chartability was developed by the Data Visualization Society Assistive Technology Group, led by Frank Ilavsky, and I've included a link to it here, and then I've also included the workbook as a download for you. The methodology for determining if your data visualizations are accessible is divided into 7 sections. You want to make sure your charts are perceivable, operable, understandable, and then under robust, you also have 3 additional areas to check, which are compromising, assistive, and flexible. You want your charts to be perceivable. In other words, anyone viewing them should be able to easily identify content using their senses. You want your charts to be operable, meaning anyone looking at your chart should be able to navigate through it easily, whether they're using a mouse or a keyboard, and it shouldn't have errors pop up or anything like that. You're going to want your charts to be understandable, meaning that you want your charts to be presented without any kind of ambiguity. You want the data to be clear, and you don't want people to have to think too much to understand what they're seeing. Robust just means that your chart should work with whatever assistive technology someone is using. For your chart to be compromising, you're going to want to include the table so that someone can delve down into the details if they want to. This stuff is where you've already done some of the tasks for the user. In other words, remember where I showed you in the big data and the small data where things were summarized? That's a good example of where the heavy lifting has already been done. The person doesn't have to add numbers up. Flexible means that a user's styling is respected. So if somebody has set up their device to work for color blindness, or if they've zoomed it in, your chart should respect whatever they have selected. Now we're going to work on making our charts accessible. And as I mentioned before, we have 7 different areas to do that in. We're going to start off in the perceivable area. So we want to make sure that there's no low contrast on your design elements and or your text. We want to make sure that there's a high enough contrast that they are all visible. We also don't want our text size to be too small. As a general rule, you want to keep your text size at around 12 points, but this is less of an issue in Excel because the viewer has the option of making the screen larger or smaller for themselves, but still 12 points is a good general rule. Then we also don't want information only available visually. In other words, we don't have anything for the screen reader or braille support. And as I mentioned before, we do that by selecting, in this instance, it's a chart, before we selected graphical elements. And we can go to Review, the Check Accessibility, and Alt Text. And you can see here that I've included alt text for this chart, giving it a description. Depending on your purpose of the chart, you're going to want to, you can be more descriptive, or you can summarize what it is you're trying to show with the particular chart. Next, you want to make sure that your color choices in your chart are colorblind safe. An easy way to do this is just go with Microsoft's default. That is definitely the laziest and easiest way to do it. And here I have examples of what using Microsoft's default color scheme, how it looks in the different colorblind variations of people. So you can see that these colors are very clear for everyone, even if they're colorblind. In addition, I've included this high contrast setting, which some people use, and you can see that this, in this instance, this is a total fail because you cannot discern any of the colors when you're using high contrast. So this chart would, if you do have people who are using the high contrast settings, this chart would be a failure for them. They would not be able to tell the difference between the different columns, and you'd want to use a different kind of chart, which is where the color is the only channel for meaningful information comes in. To combat this, you could add patterns to these columns, or you could change it to a different chart, which is what I've chosen to do. You can see here I've changed this to a what's called a slope graph. It's basically a line chart with just 2 points on it. So it shows 2020 and 2021. Even if this chart was shown, and I have used direct labeling for each of the different series. So if someone was looking at this in black and white, they would still be able to understand what the chart is showing. The last two are meaningful elements cannot be discerned, and inappropriate use of spacing. Basically, that just means that you want to make sure that what you have on your chart can clearly be read, and you don't want to have too much white space or too little white space. You don't want your labeling on top of each other. Basically, things like that. Let's move on to the operable areas. In this instance, what we have are, with this chart, because it's a pivot table chart, you could also do these with tables. We have the options of adding slicers to any of our charts. And what slicers do is allow us to filter charts in different ways. In this instance, if I wanted to use this age slicer here, I can select the 18 to 29 years and it will show just that one item. Or I could choose to select multiple items. Let's say I wanted to compare the 89 to 29 years to the 60 to 69 years. I can see just those two. We use this little funnel to clear the filter. And slicers are navigable by persons using screen readers. These types of slicers are. You do want to make sure that you do your settings on your slicers. Here we have, you select the slicer and you get a menu option for slicer. This allows you to choose your colors or your design, how your slicer is displayed. You want to make sure that you have contrast enough so it can be read. You also have slicer settings here. Notice that I've checked this box to hide items with no data. This is another part of simplification. You also want to change the name to have a meaningful name. This slicer was originally named Some Group, but because it is a slicer for age, we want to make sure that we are saying age. And this allows you to choose to display the header or not display the header. Now, where these slicers are good for persons using screen readers, the slicer over here, which is called a timeline slicer, is not. This slicer cannot be navigated with a keyboard. So that, by default, makes it inaccessible. It makes it inaccessible to persons who are using screen readers, most likely, but it definitely makes it inaccessible to persons who have mobility issues and cannot use, say, a mouse or a stylus. So you want to avoid the timeline. Instead, you could use if you want to provide the slicer for months and year, you could include it as a slicer like this, the standard slicer. In addition, you also want to make sure that your slicers, you want to add alt text to your slicers. These are simply, you just say what they are and call it a filter so that people know. You could call it a slicer, but what it is a filter, and that's more understandable. In addition, we go back up to our checklist here. You also want to make sure that you provide instructions on, if you are giving someone a chart that has interactivity, whether you're doing it through PowerPoint with animations or whether you're doing it in Excel, you want to make sure that you give instructions on how to do that. You don't want to make the assumption that people are just going to automatically know what a slicer is. You want to make the instructions as simple and clear as possible and reference just the items that are on your interactive visualization. You can see this one. We also have the option, because this is a pivot table chart, you have the option to use these plus or minus signs to expand or collapse the chart as a whole. And we've addressed that up here. These are also accessible. You just want to make sure that you explain what they are so that people know how to use them. That pretty much takes care of making sure we set everything for operable data visualizations. Now we want to make sure they're understandable. In this instance, what we have are some novel data visualizations. The top one doesn't really require much of an explanation, I think folks have seen this often enough these days in the newspapers or data journalism, where you have a shaded map of the U.S. and we have a legend with it that shows that the lower the amount of change is going to be darker, the higher amount of change is going to be lighter. The one thing you want to make sure that you do include, especially in items like this, is include a title with a summary. You want to, your data visualization is telling a story. So you need to make sure that you include a title saying what that story is. You also want to make sure that you include a source, a reference, a source to your data, so that basically folks know you aren't making it up, and that you're pulling your data from a reliable source. You want to make sure that your metrics aren't misleading or undefined. We've defined ours clearly here as the average percentage of change. We also want to consider, when you're looking at this example here, this is a tree map. Now, a tree map probably needs to be explained. Not everybody's going to know what a tree map is. This visualization doesn't work very well because there just isn't enough disparity between the percentage of change for each of the states. So nearly all of our states show up as being almost the same size. And in a tree map, the color has no meaning for the value. The value is based on the size. Then finally, we want to come down, and we've shown a bar graph here. This is a little different. This is showing the respondents reporting the reduced access to care. And what this easily shows, we've listed our states in alphabetical order on this bar chart. It's a clustered bar chart. They can see on the top level, which is 2020, and the bottom, and the orange right below it, the second bar, is 2021. So this is what folks can do, is readily look at this and see for every single state the reduced access to care based on the coronavirus has really significantly dropped from 2020 to 2021. Now, this was included here because this is a very long chart. You have to scroll through it. And one of the tenets of making things understandable is that you need to be able to scroll through something like this. Fortunately, Excel takes care of that for us. That isn't something we really need to worry about. And actually, in a lot of these, Excel takes care of them automatically for us. Moving on to the robust area. Basically, this says that your data viz works no matter how somebody has set up their PC. This isn't anything you have to worry about if you're using Microsoft products. The one thing that under robust that you are going to want to make sure of is that it works across multiple devices. I had talked about this before. You want to make sure that your data viz is viewable across multiple devices. And I have a couple of examples down here. On the left, what you see is how this same worksheet looks in the Excel web version. You can see it's basically the same. It has the same functionality, and you're going to be able to use it. That's going to be the same for folks who are using Excel on a tablet, whether it's an iPad or an Android tablet. As long as they're using the Excel app, everything's going to work fine. Now, when we move to the second image, this is an example of the worksheet in Google Sheets. This is a total fail. We've lost all our functionality, and you can see Google Sheets also changed our formatting and everything. So now our spacing is bad, our legibility is bad. So if you're going to have to share your spreadsheet in Google Sheets as well as in Excel, you're going to need to redo your spreadsheet in Google Sheets itself. For our compromising areas, this one's really easy for you. You just want to make sure that a table is provided for the chart itself. Excel's going to include that automatically, so it's not really anything that you have to worry about. You also, if you are providing it, you want to make sure that it's downloadable for folks. So unless it's on purpose, wherever you put your files, if you're sharing them, you really should be sharing them. And that's what each of these items are saying. The other thing, the last one is interactions and operations are not forgivable. All that means is that anybody who makes a change, so if I expand or if I collapse these here, I should be able to undo that, and that's going to be built into Excel as well, so not really something that you have to worry about. Under assistive, we want to make sure that the data is presented at an appropriate density. Basically, you want to make sure that it is readable. Here we've got a little bit of an issue here, so we could probably improve this by making our chart taller, and that's going to make these data labels a little clearer. It's also going to make the delineation between the lines clearer. Most of this has to do with systems like Power BI maybe that allow people to create their own data visualization. That really doesn't apply with Excel. If they're going to create their own data visualization, they can completely do whatever they want. So it's never going to fail on here. Now, one thing you do want to consider doing is if you really are wanting your data to tell a story, then you might want to include a text summary or even include a little narrative icon, as long as you provide captions with it. You can insert sound into a spreadsheet. So if you choose to do that, just remember that you want to make those elements accessible as well. And finally, moving on to flexibility. Mainly this is saying that if someone's made a styling change, it should be respected. This is handled by Excel. Again, each of these are handled by the software itself. None of these are really anything that you need to worry about. Basically, again, it's saying that you should be able to scroll through along data viz if there's explanatory animations. Now that would have an impact if you put your chart in PowerPoint and then animate it. Then this becomes an issue that you need to address. The other thing is all of these things are about the user being able to adjust things for themselves, and Excel is just going to allow you to do that. So you can see it's really, really not that hard to create accessible data viz. You just want to be mindful of that not everybody has the same sensory experience. Accessibility is also about inclusivity. So to help you learn more about that, I've included a link here to the Do No Harm guide from the Urban Institute, and it specifically addresses things like racism in data visualization. Creating accessible charts may seem overwhelming, but as long as you stick with the KISS principle, you should be just fine. The KISS principle was designed by the Navy in 1960, and basically it means keep it simple, sailor. Your key design goal should be simplicity, and you should avoid unnecessary complexity. Now, this doesn't mean that your chart designs have to be plain and non-engaging for your audience. You can still have some creative freedom in designing your charts as long as your decorative elements add to the comprehension of the chart and they don't detract from understanding the information that's in the chart. Our final topic is sharing your Excel files. When you're sharing Excel files, you're going to want to leverage the Backstage features, mainly because a lot of things matter. Size is going to matter because not everybody has the same internet connection. Location is going to matter because everybody may not have access to the location where you're sharing the file from. Findability is going to matter, meaning you want to make your file easily found if someone's searching for it. If you put protection on your file, that's going to matter. And then also you don't want hidden data in your file that somebody might find inadvertently. You have 5 options when you're pasting Excel charts into a PowerPoint or Word. The first is use the destination theme and embed the data. You can keep source formatting and embed the data, or you can use the destination theme and link data, or you can keep source formatting and link the data. And finally, you can paste any chart as a picture. When you embed data into a PowerPoint or Word, in effect, you are giving anyone you give that PowerPoint or Word document to access to the entire workbook that's embedded. So you're going to need to make that workbook accessible, and you're also going to have considerations of whether you really want to share all that data or not. When you link data, you're going to have to consider that your links might break if they aren't done properly. In addition, if you do include the linked file, you're going to need to make sure that the underlying spreadsheet is accessible. And finally, if you include your chart as a picture, you're going to want to make sure that the resolution stays clear enough if somebody needs to zoom in or magnify that chart. You're also going to want to include alt text for that picture. So that brings us to our conclusion. This should be a familiar quote to everyone, and it was made famous by Abraham Lincoln, even though it was written by the poet John Lingate. And that quote is, "You can please some of the people all of the time. You can please all of the people some of the time, but you cannot please all of the people all of the time." However, when you are designing for accessibility, that is exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to please all of the people all of the time, which can be very challenging. But as long as you do the best you can and remember to keep it simple, you're going to be okay.
Well, I hope that session pleased everyone watching. I hope you're pleased all the time, and that you'll continue to be pleased through all of the rest of the sessions for the next 30 hours. Glenna is in the chat and is available to answer questions if there is anyone out there who wants to ask any questions. But if there's not, please feel free to hang around for the next session, which will start in 9 minutes time. Please do check out the feedback survey so you can tell us how pleased you are following on from Glenna's session. And yeah, if there's nothing else, we'll get ready for the next session, which will be David Benaim's session. So we'll switch over the slides shortly once everyone's had a chance to click on the or to follow the link or to follow the QR code. Oh, sorry, I've just been told that there is a question. Just going to switch over to the Q&A. We do have one question. There we go. Is there any software or extension that can help convert the graph format from Excel spreadsheets to Google Sheets? Glenna, I don't know if you want to come off mute and try and answer this question. I certainly don't know if there's anything there. Otherwise, Glenna, if you're still around, you can try and reply to the Q&A question there as well. All right, we'll try and come back with an answer to that. But if there's no further comments, let's see. Oh, sorry, I see. Let's try this. Glenna's just told me she's permanently muted. I need to unmute her. There we go. Glenna, I can't unmute you. I think that must be something. Allow to present, change. Okay, here we go. Glenna, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yep, there we go.
Awesome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome to the stream.
Yeah. Thanks. Sadly, well, actually, you can just open an Excel file in Google Sheets, but it's not going to, as you saw in the video, it doesn't always translate well. So you're going to have to make those changes and fix it yourself. There's nothing that I know of that'll do it for you.
Fair enough. I mean, are the accessibility settings in Google Sheets reasonably easy to access, or are they harder
No.
to use than
No,
Excel?
they're horrible. They're really, really horrible. I'm sorry. I'm going to be making a video about creating accessible worksheets as well as accessible presentations and documents in Google Sheets pretty soon, but they're pretty bad. They're hard to find, and there's not a lot of them. You really have to pretty much have your checklist handy and go down it manually yourself. They don't have anything like an accessibility checker like what's built into Office.
Mm.
Your best bet is to do it in Office and upload it to Google Sheets, and then fix the visual after you do it.
Fair enough.
Seriously.
Well, Google still has a way to catch up then in that case. So look forward to seeing a video.